Hi, thank you all so much for being here bright and early with Jonathan Safran Foer. I told him in the green room I don't talk to anyone before 10 a.m., so this is really special, especially not in public. I really don't think Jonathan needs any introduction, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to let you talk about yourself mostly. But I did want to just start with the question that if any of you have read We Are the Weather, has anyone here read We Are the Weather? Yes, we have one person who has. 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. Well, for those who have read it, I wanted to know the most important pressing question, which is, did you have a burger in the airport?
So for those who, first of all, thank you for coming, and thank you, Zoe. It's a book about, sort of about vegetarianism, but more broadly about the environment and climate change and why it is so hard for most people, myself included, to act on what we know and to act on what we at least say we believe and say we care about. As it turns out, science denial of human-caused climate change is not really the problem anymore, and it's not nearly as politicized an issue as it is often spoken about. 77, I think it was, percent of Americans wanted the U.S. to stay in the Paris Climate Accords, including a majority of Republicans. So the issue, once upon a time, was an acknowledgement of what's happening. And the problem now is how do we as individuals and as communities and as countries engage with or confront what we know to be happening. So We Are the Weather is about the relationship between what we eat and the climate. And it's actually the second book I've written about food, which is kind of odd because A, I don't particularly care for writing nonfiction, and B, I'm not a foodie person. I didn't grow up, frankly, loving food or experimenting a lot with food. I became a vegetarian when I was 9 for the first time. Mark Twain once said that quitting smoking is the easiest thing in the world to do. I've done it 30 times. Becoming a vegetarian is a very easy thing to do in a similar way. I've become a vegetarian many, many times. So I wrote a book called Eating Animals, 10 years ago, something like that, about vegetarianism and about factory farming. And I didn't even write it exactly to make an argument to other people, but to figure out what it was that I really believed and how my beliefs intersected or didn't intersect with what the world is actually like, with what farming is actually like. And that reinforced my vegetarianism, but I still cheated every now and then. And so I speak about that in We Are the Weather. And I think it's an important thing to talk about inconsistency, because we live in a culture now that is so obsessed with consistency, and that social media rewards confidence and certainty more than anything else. Not even the content of your certainty, just the volume of your certainty. And as it turns out, oftentimes we don't know exactly what we think. And as it turns out, the world is usually more complex than simple. So it was very embarrassing, for obvious reasons, to admit that I'm the guy who wrote a book about why you shouldn't eat meat, and then I would eat it every now and then. But in many ways, it would have made my life easier or more appealing.
Well, I'll just
not to
say,
admit.
actually, it's, for me, one of the things I find the most successful about the book. I am one of those people that you speak about that should care about climate change, I think. And I just kind of didn't. And I certainly never once considered vegetarianism or veganism. But I do think that hearing you speak about being a human with all of your human foibles that make it so difficult to be consistent and to stick to what we know, I think that's what's the greatest success of the book, that it's actually relatable and kind of anyone can enter this world and be like, oh, I can do that. I can totally do that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. When we feel vulnerable, we tend to go toward binaries like fight or flight. most people acknowledge that both climate change and meat eating are subjects that matter. Whatever you think, wherever you fall on the spectrum of your own decision making, you acknowledge that they matter. Something important is happening. If I had written a book about, why we should drink seltzer instead of flat water, nobody would ever stand up and say, "Who do you think you are telling me what to drink?"
Right.
Nobody cares. They would just dismiss me. But if I write about why we might want to eat less meat or no meat at all, it gets people upset. And I've had that happen many times at public events. Somebody will stand up and say, "Who do you think you are? What do you know?" Or da, da, da. And what I will always respond with is, well, we obviously agree that this matters. You wouldn't be upset if it didn't matter to you. You wouldn't be upset if you didn't recognize that the stakes were high, somehow. Like, if you didn't feel accused of something important, let's put it that way. So the challenge is, how do we enter these conversations that make us vulnerable? Nobody wants to think of himself or herself as a murderer, to take a very, very extreme way of putting it. With food or with the climate, nobody, and probably especially nobody who, identifies as progressive or engaged with the future of the planet. Nobody wants to be identified as part of the problem.
Right.
And so we end up sort of recoiling a little bit or protecting ourselves from these conversations, which is totally understandable. I do it too. But there's no way forward if we can't say, hey, I want to leave a planet for my children and grandchildren that resembles the planet that I got to enjoy. I do also have to admit that I flew here yesterday from Brooklyn. And I have to admit to, if I'm being honest, many, many, many things that aren't in keeping with that broad desire. So admitting it doesn't undermine our caring. It actually can reinforce our caring, as long as we're having a conversation that is, born out of goodwill rather than a desire to beat the other person.
Right, and I think I said this to you too in the green room, but for me it was such a successful book because, as someone who should care about climate, I really never have, because the framing of the argument or the storytelling, which is something you speak about a lot in the book, is really, has always, in my opinion, been about the planet. The planet needs saving, the planet won't be okay, and I think what's so successful about We Are the Weather is that we are the planet, and we're not going to be okay. The human race isn't going to be okay. The planet actually is going to be fine, right? So it's one of the most impassioned arguments I've found for understanding weather as passionate and interesting, which almost can never be. So just adding to what you were saying. But I will say, you said you're not a foodie, and there's a lot of talk about your grandmother's chicken and carrots. So I did want to speak to that, because you're talking about a future-facing argument, right? Leaving the planet to children, that you hope they can experience the planet in a way you have. But there's so much looking to the past and so much looking to past generations. So I'm curious to have you speak about that.
So the chicken and carrots that my grandmother made, that I spoke about in the book, were not like a culinary delicacy by any great stretch of the imagination, but they are the ultimate comfort food for me. And when I think about food as a vessel for love, which it is for so many of us so much of the time, that's really what I think about. And when I became a vegetarian when I was a little boy, that was actually the most difficult thing about it, was having to tell her, and having to not eat this thing that she would always make, and that we would always say, wow, this is the best thing I've ever eaten, like a very, very simple, basic food. And so when writing about food, I thought it was not only important, but absolutely necessary to acknowledge that food isn't just calories, and it isn't even just like pleasure. It's imbued with like our personal histories, our religions, for those of us who are religious, our cultural identities. it's not as responsive to reason as it would be otherwise. And so the answer isn't to deny all of those things. It's to probe how those things might also encourage us to think about food differently. So, as I said, the chicken and carrots that my grandmother made were a kind of vessel for love. Well, what was at the bottom of that love? It wasn't the handful of ingredients that went into that meal. It was her personal traumas, the story of her survival during the war. It was the transmission of values across generations, which had nothing to do with specific ingredients, but had to do with taking care, or had to do with a feeling of plentifulness, even when resources were really scarce, as they were for almost all of her life. So what does taking care and what does like the celebration of resources have to do with food when food has to do with the climate? So it's not that I had to in any way turn my back on where I came from, even if I was choosing not to eat certain foods that were such a large part of my childhood. To me, it felt much more like turning to face where I came from. And, sometimes like saying no to something that a loved one makes is oddly enough a way of celebrating that loved one.
I mean, it's interesting, too, you speak about your grandmother, and I'd love to talk after this about being the son and grandson of survivors of the Holocaust, because I think it informs all of your work. But there's a moment where she turns down, in your book, you write about her turning down food that could have saved her, specifically because it wasn't kosher. So I just want to say that it feels very tied to that, actually, in terms of keeping like what we know to be true about our ethics. And what did she say? There's like this great line. She said,
if not, when she was escaping the Nazis, she was eating out of garbage cans, and not garbage cans, but whatever, piles of cast-offs, and a benevolent farmer saw her and offered her meat, and it was pork, and she wouldn't eat it. And I remember when she told me the story, I was really taken aback, and I felt like, ooh, that's not the decision I would have made. And I said, you wouldn't eat it even to save your life. And she said, if nothing matters, there's nothing to save. And the point that she, I believe, was trying to transmit was not that eating this way or that way is what is so important, but rather what's so important is being somebody who has lines. You say, I will not cross this line, or I can no longer be myself. And it's like a really interesting and really scary thing to do, to question what your own lines are. I think about it a lot. I'm constantly, to come back to your first question, transgressing my own lines and disappointed with myself, not because I'm trying to be perfect. That has nothing to do with it. It has to do with, like, your lines also trace who you are. They trace your outline. And I don't know about you, and I don't know about you, but it feels like the culture, even though we keep moving toward rewarding confidence and certainty, there's less respect for lines or for moral choices, and everything has taken on a kind of flexibility or a casualness or an irony. It's very, very, very rare that you meet somebody or that it comes up in your own life when you say, I'm just not going to do that. Right. Even if it makes things easier, even if it denies a pleasure, even if, maybe even especially, even if I could make money doing that. Mm-hmm. I have so much respect for people who say no. Not because they're saying no on my terms or in response to my values. Sometimes when they say no and I disagree with their reasons for saying no. I have a 14-year-old who is very stubborn and who says no all the time. And 90% of the time I wish he would say yes, and it drives me bananas. But I respect him so much, and I have said to him many times, like, please less with me, but with other people, keep saying no, because that's like a skill that we're losing. Right. Everything is going with the flow. It's, part of that might have to do with the fact that we are like instruments of algorithms and no longer even know what it is that we want to say yes or no to. We only know what's put before us and that it's appealing, and so we do it. And again, I'm not like wagging a finger. This is the story of my life as well. But we have these occasions sometimes and writing a book is a great occasion to do this. Writing is a great occasion to do this. It's why I would encourage everybody to write. The world doesn't necessarily need more published books and more writers, but if everybody created a context for just stopping and thinking, exploring what it is that they really believe, what they want to say yes to, what they want to say no to, it at least makes it more possible.
That's beautiful, and I think a really wonderful opportunity to talk a little bit about your process of writing. And I remember hearing you say in an early interview that when you wrote your first book, Everything is Illuminated, you didn't set out to write a book, you set out to have an experience. And in both Eating Animals and in We Are the Weather, you talk a lot about the circumstances that precipitated you writing those books. I'd love to hear a bit more about what propels you to write a book and then actually what you do to write it.
I never really meant to become a writer. I was not a voracious reader when I was younger. I never kept a diary. If you had asked me when I went to college, what are 10 things you think you might do with your life, writing would not have been in that list. And then, as sometimes happens, one thing led to another, and I found myself working on a project not to publish a book, not even to complete a book, but just to sort of see what it was like. I did a lot of things at that point in my life just to see what it was like. And I was I got incredibly lucky. And in other ways, unlucky in having success at a very early age. I was lucky for just the obvious reasons, and I was really like the luckiest person I know, the luckiest writer. Just, I was given the gift of time. I could, when I sold my first book, I was a receptionist. I'd been a receptionist for about 2 years. And I did not have control of my time. And then ever since my first book came out, I've had control of my time. And that's the only thing that's truly valuable that money can buy. So there are many, many blessings. It's been a blessing to have met as many writers as I've met. Having conversations like this, who is so lucky to be able to, as a part of one's life, have conversations about things that you believe in and care about. The curse is that I then became a professional writer, and then I had expectations, mostly internal rather than external. This is who I am. This is what I'm going to do. I better do it again, and then I'll do it again after that. And anything that becomes a profession or becomes monetized, it just changes. And there are things about that change that can be good. Like we were talking about this before. It can be good to have expectations. It can be good to have, to know that someone's going to read what you write rather than not to know. But it can be really confusing at least as well. So my reasons for writing books have changed over time. The first one, I was just like, Everything is Illuminated. It was just joyful. And which is not to say, I was writing about some really hard stuff, but it felt very self-expressive, very explosive, very reckless in a really nice way. My second book, I was aware of myself as a writer. The awareness of oneself as a writer is maybe the only kind of awareness that's bad to have as a writer, because it just makes something self-conscious that should otherwise be intuitive or natural. It makes taking risks a little bit more difficult, if only because you take risks on purpose. rather than because you want to prove your originality or you want to be provocative. It's harder just to be yourself in an authentic way. Then I wrote a nonfiction book. Then I wrote another novel. Then I wrote another nonfiction book. And all the time, my life was really changing. I had kids. I moved. I became older. And all of that influenced not only what I created, but my reasons for creating it. And now I find it really, really puzzling why to write. I do. And I think my best answer is it's not because it's going to solve any problems in the world. Maybe you can make a tiny contribution, but I'm not a huge believer in that. I read a book that I quite liked once called The Architecture of Happiness. And the author spoke about how when we enter different kinds of buildings, this is one of those ideas that's totally obvious once it's been said, but it wasn't really obvious until someone pointed it out to you, that different structures encourage different kinds of thoughts and feelings. So if you go into a Gothic cathedral, it's almost hard not to have lofty thoughts and deep feelings. The building was designed to elevate and rarefy. And if you go into a Dunkin' Donuts, it's kind of hard to have deep thoughts and feelings, or you're not encouraged to. You tend to have plasticky, dingy, fluorescent lighty thoughts and feelings. Nothing against Dunkin' Donuts. America runs on Dunkin', for better and worse. So it's important to think about the kinds of buildings we go into. I don't think that it is materialistic and crass necessarily to really care about how your home looks. People who create reading nooks tend to go into reading nooks and read. And people who have lighting on walls that can be dimmed have a different experience than people who have, lights like this above them. People who use candles have a totally different experience. These things are subtle, but everything is kind of subtle. And the sum of these subtleties is your life. I am not somebody who walks down the street with an interior monologue. I don't believe I even have an interior monologue ever. I just don't. I never ever say hey, Jonathan, why do, bad things happen to good people? I just don't. The most I might do is I'm hungry.
Right.
So.
And what will I eat?
Yeah. And again, this sounds like a bit of a joke, but it's just not a joke. I only have thoughts and feelings in two situations. One, when I'm responding to something. If you ask me a thought-provoking question, I will think about it and I will have an answer to you. If we weren't sitting here talking and I was just sitting on this stage, I would not be speaking like I am right now, obviously. I wouldn't be having any of the kinds of thoughts that are stimulated by our conversation. So it's important to be around people. People are structures in this way as well, or friendships are, dynamic, interpersonal dynamics are. It's good to have friends who make you think and feel the ways you want to think and feel. So that's one. And the other is creating contexts for thoughts and feelings. Some people find that in religion. Some people find it in education. I find that writing creates a context for me to think about things and feel things. And I don't know that helps the world, but it helps me, to figure out who I actually am as opposed to who I pretend to be or who I think I should be. It's often really confusing. We think things and we feel that we feel things, but sometimes that's just because we want to. It's aspirational. We were talking backstage about how my family's history comes up quite a bit in my work. If I hadn't become a writer and you had asked me, someone had asked me, is your Jewish identity important to you? I think I probably would have said not especially. I'm not a religious person. I don't go to synagogue. I don't it's not that big a deal to me. If someone had said, "Is your family's history, the experiences during the war, are they important to you?" I would have said, they're there. They are a part of where I come from, but it's not. I don't dwell on it. It's not. And then I wrote these books, and it's like, at the end of a trial when the prosecutor raises the bloody glove and says, "Well, this person's been telling you this story the whole time, but now we have an artifact of what actually happened, and clearly he's guilty." When I look at my books, they're like bloody gloves in that way. Like, I said I felt this thing, I said I thought this thing, but clearly I was thinking these other things and feeling these other things. So again, it's a reason why it's just a good thing to write. Whether you want to finish a book, whether you want to finish a story, whether you want to publish something, is neither here nor there. But sitting down and insisting on a context for encountering yourself, it's amazing. If you just, again, I can't speak for everybody, but for myself, I could go an entire year without encountering myself more than once or twice. Maybe on a birthday I would, because that is a context for thinking about, like, I'm getting older. What have I done? What do I want to do? New Year's Eve sometimes does that. Like, there are these markers along the way that force or encourage you to confront yourself. Otherwise, you're just like moving from, Amazon order to lunch. Like, just thing
One meal to the next. That's it.
just thing to thing that they don't do anything for you other than bring you to the next such occasion. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants to make a life like that. You want to, like, touch the deep stuff.
Right. Well, you definitely do. All of your books touch the deep stuff, and it's really interesting to hear you speak that way because, your books are really Jewish. Like, you have, I'm sorry to say, or not sorry to say, but truly you definitely feel in all of your books, fiction or nonfiction, and I want to go back to why you don't like writing nonfiction, because it's fascinating that your last two books have been. But clearly there's so much of the survivors, being a descendant of survivors in your work, and I think it's interesting. In We Are the Weather, you speak about your grandmother was ailing and she was dying, and her life as a survivor and how she created a life for future generations seems so tied to why you chose to write a book about how future generations will survive.
Yeah, that wasn't really planned. Like, she just fell ill while I was writing this book, and I found, like, a long time ago that I could make a choice to either pursue what I think are good ideas or to pursue stuff as it comes up. And I chose to pursue stuff as it comes up. Joseph Brodsky, the poet, said, the rhyme is smarter than the poet. People write in verse because it's pretty and it's interesting and it's nice, but also because when you're forced to rhyme with the word that ends the line above, you have a kind of problem. You can't say things exactly as you would have otherwise if you'd been completely free. And the solution to the problem is very, very often more interesting than what you would have done if you hadn't had that problem. And I just allow that into my life. I assume that the things that I am led to will be more important to me than the things that I would have chosen. You were asking me about how I write. So and this has changed over time, and now, sort of inspired by everything I just said, I try to pursue those rhymes, I guess. So what I will do, and we can actually do this as a group, it will be sort of interesting. I teach, and I sometimes do this with my class. I will think back over the last day and, is there anything that just caught my attention? I'm not worried about the novel I'm working on or the nonfiction book I'm working on. I'm not worried about making progress, just interrogating myself. Like, did I find anything interesting? Did I overhear anything? Did I see something? Could be something as nothing as like a missing bird poster on a on a pole in the city, or something unusual floating in a puddle, or a joke I heard. It could be anything. And if nothing occurs to me, first of all, I think, ooh, I should do a better job noticing, because that's unfortunate to live a whole day without having anything be interesting to me. But then I'll just look around the room. Does anything seem interesting to me? So, like right now, there's a clock here that's counting down.
To the end of the world.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're down to 14 minutes. That's interesting to me. I have no idea why. I could probably give an answer, but the truth is, it's interesting. And then I will close my eyes and I'll think, does that remind me of anything? Does that make me think of anything? I don't have to be able to explain why it makes me think of that. It could be the color red. It could be the font. It could have nothing to do with clocks at all. It could have to do with when something's at my feet. I don't know. Does it make me think of anything? So I will ask you, and somebody has to be brave, does a backward ticking clock at your feet make you think of anything? Doesn't. Don't like force it. Just does anything occur to you? Do you think about anything? Cooking food. Can you try to be like a little bit more concrete and really like put your finger on a specific memory or image? Right. Okay, so managing time while cooking food. Does that make anybody think of anything? And again, try not to be literal. So try not to think about food and try not to think about backward ticking clocks. That experience of like managing stuff with an oven or range, and does that make anybody think about anything?
Yes. Mortality.
Who said that? And like, can you be more concrete or more specific about it? Okay, so normally when we think about birthdays and getting older, we see the numbers increasing, but there is this weird other clock which we're not aware of, because we know on what day we're born, but we don't know on what day we'll die. And yet we have like some dim awareness that like, in addition to, moving away from birth, I'm also moving toward death. Does that make anybody think of anything? And try to come up with like an image, and again, you could say something where nobody, including you, could explain what the connection is. That really doesn't matter. It's just like, is anything stimulated? Time is reducing, not expanding. And so then I would think, well, what are other things that reduce and don't expand? Or other things that we can be confused about and thinking that they're growing, but they're actually shrinking. So anyway, I would just do this for a little while. And what's odd is you like start with a backward ticking clock at the bottom of the stage, and suddenly you find yourself thinking about this little town in Spain where they have an annual celebration of blah, blah, blah. Like it's like a game of telephone, but with your own consciousness. And
with your own internal monologue.
Yes. But see, that's because I created the context for it.
Right.
And I usually find that it leads me to places that I care about. Like there are things that you just want to like explore, or there are things that are latent that you want to bring to the surface, and you can create exercises to do that. And I find that they tend to not only be interesting on a like psychological level, but on an artistic level. And Here I Am, which is my last novel, I basically wrote that whole book with that process I just described. So I would say the book has a lot of like, I don't know what you would call them, asides or vignettes. The main character listens to podcasts. And so that was a way to like sneak in different kinds of information. And so, there's a riff, for example, on sign language and different accents that different deaf people have in different parts of the world in their sign language. There's a part about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. These were things I never would have thought, hey, I'm writing this book about divorce and the Middle East. Surely there's got to be a way to bring sign language into it, or, dinosaurs. No, it's that I would think, what's interesting to me right now? And I believe that if you pursue what is interesting to you, good things will happen. You can't always predict what they will be. If nothing else, you will become aware of what's interesting to you, which seems valuable. But it's not totally dissimilar from therapy. Like if the therapist is quiet long enough, it's like a horrible experience, especially given how much they charge. But if they're quiet long enough, you will fill the space. Right. And you will fill the space with things. Sometimes you're surprised to fill the space with that. So, writing is a good way to create these spaces that you then have to fill. And I find exercises like that just sort of like jumpstart it.
Okay, two things. So where do the exercises take place? Like, do you make yourself go sit down at a desk every day, or how does it actually happen?
I am not too proud to admit that I do a lot of my writing in bed. Oh. Yeah, which is
actually,
terrible for me.
You talk about a lot of bedrooms. You're like, I'm sitting on the floor of my grandmother's room. I'm sitting on the floor of my child's room. You do that a lot, no?
Yeah, I guess I do. I do. It hadn't occurred to me. It's really funny having things pointed out to you that are true that hadn't occurred to you. One of I think it was the first reading I ever did actually in New York. I had an interviewer who said, I think it's so interesting how you brought, and I can't even remember what Shakespeare play it was, in Othello, whatever, into that scene. And it's just such a deft weaving of la la. And I said, listen, I've actually never read that play. I got to be honest. And she said, no, but you did, look. And she made this case. And I said, I guess I agree with you. Like, your case is really persuasive. And so then what? Like, how do we understand that? Like, maybe through some sort of weird osmosis, I just internalized aspects of the play. I don't know, but meaning starts to move away from you after you send a book out into the world, and it becomes a kind of, I don't know, collective meaning. I wrote in college. I was a philosophy major, and I wrote my thesis on the difference between a writer and an author. So, like, the writer is the person who actually wrote the book, and the author is the person that we imagine when we read the book. So the writer lived a real life. The author lived a kind of imagined life. And when we interpret a book, we're thinking about the author, not the writer. So the author could have read every Shakespeare play, unless it was, physically impossible for chronological reasons. So Moby Dick cannot be a Vietnam War allegory, because Melville wasn't alive for the Vietnam War. But it could be alluding to any piece of literature that predated its composition. There's a funny thing being the writer and the author, sort of, or like situations like this where things are pointed out to me about not the real me who wrote the book, but the me that they conjure. And it's especially weird when I agree with them, like when something is pointed out that seems so true, even though I didn't intentionally put it there.
So writing in bed, you write in bed.
I write in bed. Yeah, I write in bed. I teach at NYU. I have an office there. I sometimes go there. For years and years and years, I thought all my problems could be explained by not having the right work setup. Like, if I just had an office like this, if I just had a window, if I just had my laptop elevated, if I just, the only thing that I've learned that truly matters, is not having internet access. and not having a phone around. It just destroys everything, but it especially destroys any activity that you need to be present for, which is most activities we care about. There have been like many studies that demonstrate the destructive power of distraction, but that's not even exactly what I mean. Like, it's hard to be yourself when you're constantly pushed and pulled by others. And the internet is doing nothing if not constantly pushing and pulling you.
I think we're like almost done. I did want to say, Here I Am's my favorite book. Everyone should get it. I've read it like 6 times, and that's a lie.
You said 7, by the way.
That's a lie. I haven't read it 6 or 7. It's actually 4. Don't trust the storyteller ever. 4 times. But it's your last novel, and one, I just told you this, but I literally almost don't know what it's about. I mean, I do, but I just think about how it made me feel. It's one of these books that, like, you laugh, you cry. It's so corny, but it's so true, and it's really so powerful, so thank you. But I'm wondering, are we going to get another novel from you? Do you have a book you're working on you want to talk about that you don't want to talk about?
This is when I go pale.
Yes.
And
Tell us. I want to make you nervous.
First of all, thank you for saying that. It's the only book that I feel really proud of. And I say that not to diminish anything else, just I feel close to it. You know, I guess it was my last novel, and I've changed so much. You know, when you think about back over your life, so many of the things that you did when you were younger, you think, oh, I wouldn't do it that way again. Not that you even necessarily regret it, just it's not how you would do it now. And that book, I'm still close enough to that I can look at it and say, like, oh, that is a pretty good expression of what my concerns were at the time and my way of expressing myself. I've been working on a lot of different things. You might not be surprised, given what I just said, that I've been working on a nonfiction book about technology. I have been working on a novel. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to talk about. It's only because I find it really dispiriting. Like, it's one of the shames of writing is that I guess it's good in a way too, but like your progress is measured. So, you know, I have I'm friends with Jonathan Franzen, and he says, people always ask me, why did it take you 10 years to write that book? And he says, no, it took me like 9 months to write that book. It just took me 9 years and change to be ready to write the book. And it's hard to say, in response to your question, what are you working on? It's hard to say, like, oh, I'm just getting myself ready to work on something. That sounds like an evasion, or it sounds silly, or it sounds like an excuse. And that's just unfortunate because it's true.
No, I don't think it sounds like that at all. I have a very good friend who's an artist who always says there's the marination period, and like you just have to have the marination period. You can't just sit down and start doing the thing.
Yeah, and writing I find to be really exhausting in a humane way. Not like I can't imagine putting that much energy in again. More like in the sense of what I had to say, I said. You know, I write the kinds of books. I'm really glad to hear your description of Here I Am, because that's exactly how I would want it to be read, which is like, I don't even really know what it's about. It's just about a lot. And when I was writing it, that's how I felt. And when I finished it, I felt exhausted in the sense of having said what I wanted to say. And now I need to like refill the reservoir of things that I want to say.
That's so real. That's beautiful. I think that's like a gorgeous way for us to maybe close out. We don't really have time for questions according to the ticking clock, so I think we're just going to say goodbye. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful.